So it's recording. Alrighty. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on sensory processing disorders and FND. You might see that I'm looking at another screen, so I've got two screens in front of me. So I'm going to try and look back here when I can. My name is Istabrick, and I'm an occupational therapy student from the University of Sydney. I'm completing this placement with FND Australia with Dr. Catherine Gill. Firstly, I'd like to extend my gratitude for the amazing experience I have had and the great privilege of learning about functional neurological disorder from the organisation and the members. I hope today's experience will be interactive, so please feel free to share your stories, experiences, and any ideas that you have. You can either pop them in the chat or just unmute yourselves. I had a particular interest in sensory processing disorders from my last placement when I was working with children, and I felt intrigued to understand this furthermore in the adult population and specifically in people with FND. Now I'd like to make acknowledgement of country. So I acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which I am on today and on which I am presenting, the Bidjigal people of the Darug Nation. I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. I recognize their connection to country and their role in caring for and maintaining country over thousands of years. So what are we discussing today? We'll be looking at sensory regulation and sensory modulation, sensory processing disorders and what they are, the relationship between sensory processing disorders and FND, the role of occupational therapy in FND, and sensory modulation training as an emerging treatment. So this all begins in 1972 when an American occupational therapist named Dr. A. Jean Ayres defined the sensory integration theory. So she named this as a neurological process that organizes sensation from one's own body and from the environment, and makes it possible to use the body effectively within the environment. So she noticed this from her observations in children with autism spectrum disorder and from her knowledge of neuroscience. She noticed deficits in learning and in behavior, to which she hypothesized as full processing of sensation by the central nervous system. So sensory integration focuses on how we interact our sensory systems. So that includes the auditory, the vestibular, the tactile, the visual, and the proprioceptive systems, and integrating this information to contribute to our learning and our adaptive behaviors. Having deficits in interpreting the sensation from our body and from the environment that we are in leads to difficulties in our motor planning, our motor learning, and our academic performance. This also leads to challenges in our in body coordination, our dyspraxia, and ultimately high executive functioning and cognition. So Ayres focused on the three senses, the vestibular, the proprioceptive, and tactile systems. Now, research today confirms the significance of the vestibular input on our functions such as arousal regulation, our static and dynamic postural control, our balance, and our equilibrium response. But I'd like to discuss the three hidden senses, as they say. These are the vestibular, the proprioceptive, and the interoceptive. So vestibular relates to our ability to process balance and movement. These are the receptors that are located in our inner ear. This sense helps us to distinguish between speed and direction of movement. Proprioception are the receptors that are located in our muscles and in our joints. They provide information about where we are in space. So it gives us a sense of body awareness and coordination. And finally, interoception. These are the receptors that are in our internal organs, and they provide information on our internal body and emotional state. So it gives you the feeling of thirst, hunger, the need to go to the toilet, and it also makes sense of our understanding of our heartbeat and our breathing. As we can see in the schematic here, this is a sensory integration process. So we have inputs, it's what we hear, what we see, what we feel, what we eat, all the information that comes from our 8 senses. It then gets to the brain where it interprets it, it filters out and tunes out all this information to produce outputs, which we can see as our ability to concentrate, our ability to organize ourselves, our speech, our self-esteem, our self-control, our self-confidence, our academic learning ability, and our capacity for abstract thought and reasoning. And this is ultimately to allow us to self-regulate, interact socially, develop relationships, and have adaptive behaviors and skills. So the information that we receive from our senses, as we have here on the inputs, needs to be integrated by the brain. Now, sensory integration dysfunction is when this process does not go accordingly, and therefore we cannot process and integrate these sensations. This leads to an inability to produce appropriate motor outcomes. And this is going to interfere with our day-to-day activities, our functioning, and our performance. Ayres' theory of sensory integration not only just explains the dysfunction that happens and the interventions that can be done, but it also postulates that sensory integration can impact one's learning. So this entire process here gets disrupted with sensory processing disorders. Thanks, Tina. I'll try and slow down. Thanks for the comment. Okay, so sensory processing disorders is an umbrella term. There are three different categories under that. So we have sensory discrimination disorder, sensory modulation disorder, and sensory-based motor disorder. Today, I'm going to be looking at the sensory modulation disorder and dyspraxia, most common ones in FND. So sensory modulation is our ability for the brain to filter out and tune into the sensory information it needs to make sense of the information that's required for us participating in a task or an activity. So dysfunction will look like over-responsivity, under-responsivity, or us seeking or craving sensory input. Now, this is ultimately going to impact your engagement and your occupations and the roles in your daily life. So the diagram that I have here is Dunn's four-quadrant model of sensory processing. This was created by an occupational therapist named Winnie Dunn, and she has two constructs or two features in this particular model. The first being the neurological threshold, which is seen here on this axis, going from low to high, and the second being the behavior response, seen from passive self-regulation to active self-regulation in the environment. So what do they mean? So the neurological threshold relates to a person's threshold in responding to the sensory stimuli in their environment, and this varies from person to person. Whilst a person can have a low threshold and they are quick to notice sensory input, whether it's something that they see or something that they can hear, this activates their sensory systems and their central nervous system. On the other hand, a person that has a high threshold will be not as responsive. And the second construct is also on a continuum, and it relates to a person's behavioral responses. And again, a person can either have a passive or an active response to the environment. I'm going to try and explain this further. So we're going to use the analogy that's commonly used of the sensory processing cups, or we can think of them as a set of cups that represent our sensory systems. So for each sensory system, we have a cup. This cup can vary in size. Each person's cup will vary in size, and therefore the amount of sensory information that they can hold will vary. It's going to be about $3,000. I think someone's joining in. Sorry, if I can ask you to mute yourselves because there's a bit of background noise. Thank you. No, that's okay. Thanks. Okay, so we as humans aim to fill our cups, but we don't want them to overflow. Having a big sensory cup like this one here will mean that we need to fill it up with more sensory information or sensory input. On the other hand, a small cup like this can only handle a small amount of information before it overflows. So having a small cup, you'll become over-responsive to sensory information. By having a big cup, you might be under-responsive, and therefore you will need to fill it up with more to feel satisfied and engaged. So over-responsiveness can look in different ways. If you take a look at the different sensory systems that we have, from a tactile perspective, a person might be sensitive to touch, or they dislike hair or nail cutting. Oftentimes people dislike messy play, or they dislike wearing shoes, or certain clothing or tags or textures can be annoying. From a proprioceptive and vestibular point of view, individuals might avoid swings or slides. They might have troubles going up and down stairs, or they can have difficulty walking backwards. People can have poor postural control, so it's your core stability being poor, or you have difficulty in being hugged. From an auditory, a visual, or an olfactory perspective, so it's what you hear, what you see, and what you smell, people can react strongly to loud or sudden sounds. This can include the doorbell, fire alarm, or the toilet flushing. You're unable to take instructions because you feel overwhelmed. Or you can be overwhelmed by bright lights. Often, you can also react to very strong smells. In the under-responsiveness domain, an individual is often slow to register sensory input and they will have low arousal. So if we take a look at this diagram again, you are considered to have low registration. So what does this look like for a person? A person might have poor body awareness. They may appear to be clumsy, have poor balance or posture, and poor coordination. Oftentimes, people can be seen swinging, fidgeting, or running around to seek sensory input because they're seeking that sensation. From a tactile or like interoceptive point of view, a person may appear to be fearless. So they're not noticing pain, they can fall and not realize that they've hurt themselves. They are not able to perceive hot or cold temperatures, or otherwise they may be seeking to touch everything and anyone. From an auditory and visual perspective, individuals are not able to follow oral instructions. They may appear to be disinterested or show poor attention. Some people can also have difficulty with their visual perception and their ability to coordinate their eye and hand movements. Okay, now dyspraxia is another one, and it comes from the word praxis. So this is our ability to plan and sequence motor actions. Praxis involves 3 steps. So it's ideation, coming up with an idea, planning the idea, and doing the idea. And this relates to movement or motor actions. So when we have difficulties processing what we feel, what we hear, or what we experience in sensory systems, this results in difficulties with praxis. So difficulty coming up with an idea, planning it, and creating new motor actions or movements. For a person, they may appear to be clumsy, they may have poor balance, a poor posture, they might have poor eye-hand coordination. And it's very hard for them to learn new movements and new skills. Now, if we take a look at this diagram here, dyspraxia can influence a number of domains. It can impact a person's concentration. So a person might be easily impacted by background noise. A person might struggle to take notes, or they have poor listening skills, or they struggle to put their ideas onto paper. Dyspraxia can also impact a person's fine motor skills, and this will impact the things that they can do on a day-to-day basis. It can impact a person's organization skills. So individuals might need a visual to remind themselves with things, or they might find playing difficult. It will impact their concentration, so they can be easily distracted or have limited focus, or they can have poor memory skills. And these things are very common in people with FND. Okay, so now this brings me to sensory regulation. And what is sensory regulation? It's ultimately relating to the person's optimal level of arousal. So when we have challenges in our sensory integration ability, we will be dysregulated. Our central nervous system is designed to filter out information and tune this information through a gating mechanism. But in people that have sensory processing problems and people with FND, there's a challenge in this. You must achieve sensory regulation to achieve the just right level of arousal. And by that, I mean you need to match your internal levels and arousal levels to the demands of the task and the environment to which you are in. When your arousal is too low, so if you're in deep sleep, or if your arousal is too high, when you're extremely agitated or stressed, you will not be able to function. And that means you can't integrate the sensory information that you're receiving from your senses. And this is going to impact your overall sensory regulation and your self-regulation on an emotional, a cognitive, and a behavioral level. So to be sensory regulated, you want to have an emotionally balanced state. This will lead to focused attention and engagement. You'll be comfortable in engaging with your sensory experiences, and you will have pleasure and satisfaction from the sensory experiences. So every task you do, and in every environment that you are in, there will be differing levels of arousal that you need. And the ability to adjust this level of arousal in respect to this is your regulation. But I understand in FND, this can sometimes be a challenge. Okay, so as most of you are aware, functional neurological disorder is the intersection between neurology and psychiatry. This diagram that I have here represents FND, and it's basically reflecting the problem of the brain networks leading to the neurological symptoms that some people experience. When Ayres explained in her sensory integration theory, she said that the limbic system plays an important role in our sensory integration. and our ability to register the information that comes from our senses. So FND results from a dysfunction in these neural pathways that we can see here, ultimately impacting a person's attention, interoception, and emotion processing ability, as well as the sensory integration. Today's research has indicated that the symptoms of FND experienced by people are a result of the abnormal brain circuits. So these symptoms can include abnormal movements, having gait disorder, experiencing seizures or paralysis, having problems with your speech or your communication, and having problems with your cognition, your memory, and your thinking ability. So on to you, dear guests. I would like to hear from people who are comfortable in sharing their experiences about what they have experienced with their FND journey. If you would like to unmute, or if you just want to pop it in the chat. Sam, I will definitely share the material after this webinar today, and hopefully you can have a larger version of this of the content, definitely. So anyone would like to maybe just share what they've experienced or...
Hi, Sam O'Neill. I have FND. I actually had a question in relation to processing, something that I've identified as we've just been working through some of those persistent symptoms I have. Instead of the light sensitivity, I seem to have visual movement sensitivity. So if there's a lot of activity in my visual field, similar, not like epilepsy, but similar to like if there's a lot of things on a TV screen, or like if my kids and my dog are going real crazy in front of me and there's really a lot of chaos in the movement, I really do overload.
Mhm.
And I just wonder if that's a symptom that others have had or that has been reported with FND. It's an interesting one, I think. Is that the same as you, Tina? Yeah, she's saying,
Yeah.
yeah. So, yeah. Do
I've
you know about that,
yeah,
Istabrook?
I've seen that a lot with the client cohort that I've worked with, and someone said, my daughter dropped a cat on the floor, and just that movement set off her seizure. So it's because there's a problem with the way the brain is processing information. So you've got your movement processing, your visual processing, and with FND, we know the connectivity is not working properly in the brain. The brain is not processing information properly. So it's something that I see a lot, and people say when they're driving, they can't see, the movement from being a passenger in the car. And people will have to wear one of those night masks to cover their eyes because they can't cope with the visual movement. So in terms of it being in terms of the literature on it, there's limited research on sensory processing disorders in FND. As Brick and I found, it's only a handful of papers that's actually been documented. In terms of what I see clinically, I see that a lot, like absolutely huge. And the other thing that I've seen clinically is I've done sensory profiles on people, and every person that I've done a sensory profile on has come up in the extreme levels. Yeah, so as Brick's showing here. So what we tend to see, this was in the actual research paper. So what I see is low registration can be a bit more mixed, but in terms of, so we've got more than most people, similar to most people, or less than most people. So what I tend to see is people, low registration is mixed, but generally it comes up, more than most people. Your sensory seeking is like significantly less than most people. So people with FND are just over with that threshold level. They're not seeking sensation at all. They're highly sensitive and they're highly avoiding. And I've done so many sensory profiles, and everyone, especially in seeking sensitivity and avoiding, has been the same pattern. And I wonder, are people do they have sort of extreme sensory processing disorders that makes them vulnerable to FND? Or is it that FND is affecting the way the brain processes sensory information? So we don't have research on which came
No.
first.
But interestingly, with children, sorry to jump in, Kate, but just with I have two children, and both of them have different spectrums of sensory processing. So one is hyper and one is hypo, and very different, absolutely chalk and cheese, but both with those types of sensory processing disorders that Estabrook has talked about in this webinar, which is, it's really, where's that connected? We've got to find that connectivity. It's so interesting.
It is, and this is something that, to me, it's under-recognized and under-researched. And I'm like, if we could, I know we have your motor retraining, they sort of, the research, the motor retraining, it says CBT. But to me, this is something that every cohort of people that I work with dealing with, and you can sort of see it coming up in the comments as well. And also when people get overloaded, can we just make sure that everyone's on mute, please? When people get overloaded, they do get their seizures. So to me, if we did interventions that addressed people's sensory processing, I think, that's an untapped area of FND research. I'm just having a think, someone's mentioned supermarkets. So supermarkets is traditionally, everyone has problems with that. You've got your movement, you've got your noise, you've got your lighting, the trolleys, like having people walk past with a string of trolleys. And then people said sensitive to loud noises, heat, music, bright lights. Yep. Supermarkets, ticks. Yep. And seizures, lights, noise, touch. Yep. So you can see that everyone's identifying with it. And then someone's mentioned too hot. And absolutely, I find with FND, when I've worked with people clinically, there's a lot of temperature dysregulation problems. And when people tend to not manage extremes in temperatures. So they don't manage cold, they don't manage hot. And I've certainly had clients where just having a shower and the feel of the water on their skin and the temperature can set off a seizure. So absolutely, temperature is an issue. We know in MS, people with MS have temperature regulation issues, and I'm seeing it with FND, but there's no research on it. Too cold as well. Yep. How can a sensory profile be used to help manage FND symptoms? A sensory profile is an OT tool that OTs can use to assess the person's profile around what they're overreacting to, what they're responding, and then you can devise a tailored plan. Diagnosed with ADHD and bipolar, yes, I see that's a common comorbidity. Visual therapy, that sounds interesting. Yeah. All right, so that's sort of some of the stuff that I've just seen clinically. Sorry for butting in, Estabrook, but I've just seen a lot of clients.
Yeah.
And it's something that I've worked with a lot of clients as well.
Yeah.
And the other one, yeah, so that's Elizabeth. She can relate to this, and not seizures, but your motor tics with sounds. And certainly, like if I see like a flash of bright light, that can set off jerks. So, and for some people that would set off seizures. So to me, this is a really, really pivotal issue in FND that's under-recognized.
Yes, it's under-recognized, and there's not a lot of research and literature to support any of the interventions that can be possible for people with FND. So yeah, and also speaking to some of the members over the last few weeks, I've noticed that some people have temperature regulation problems. So oftentimes they'll need someone to like adjust the water temperature before going into a shower because they're at high risk of either burning themselves with like really hot water. So I really appreciate everyone sharing their thoughts.
Yeah. The pylori, was that I might be wrong with that. That's not a bacterial gut infection, is it?
I think pylori, H. pylori is the bug in the stomach that
Yeah,
causes.
it's a stomach, like that's what I thought it was.
Yes.
Okay, so what I found in terms of gut issues is a number of people, their FND starts following a bout of gastric, or people that have had weight loss surgery where they've lost a lot of weight in a short amount of time, or people with eating disorders where they're not getting enough nutrients. So if this causes stomach issues, it reduces your body's resilience. So that can be a trigger to set FND off. So to me, it's not like this is the single cause and FND is the outcome. To me, it's people have a variety of things that weaken the body, and it can be anything. But whatever it is, the body's resilience is reduced. The body is under strain. The nervous system is under strain. It doesn't matter what caused that strain. So absolutely related if you are unwell and you had a bout of gastric or something.
I just wanted to note, I feel like it's a web, Kate. I see it as a sort of a big spider web of things that all the spiders in the middle, FND, and it's just this web of other things that have led to that. I don't know if anyone else sort of sees it like that, but I definitely feel that myself.
Yeah. So how can we make our nervous systems better? I mean, with the program that I'm currently running, we don't have any ongoing funding for it, but the second half of the program is around how do we regulate our nervous system? So how do we reduce the stress and the strain and improve that regulation of the nervous system so it's not so responsive, sort of a bit like the overflowing cup. Like, if you've got an empty cup and you put a little bit of stress in, the cup can hold that. But if your cup is full and then you try and put a bit more stress into it, it's going to overflow. So what we want to do is reduce it so that the body can cope with little bits of stress without being overloaded and leading to these symptoms. And in the second half of our course, we do address that. But saying that, we've got no ongoing funding for the program. So I'm getting referrals left, right, and centre for it. And I'm like, well, I don't have funding to run it yet. So it is around, is it possible to recover? Look, some people do, some people don't. And a lot of people will say it's around managing the condition. So managing your triggers, looking at your whole life, your whole environment, everything that you do, so that your nervous system is not getting overwhelmed. And when people have coexisting medical conditions, to me, it's not sort of like condition, treatment, better, and that's it. It's when you've got comorbid health conditions or environmental circumstances, or whatever the circumstances is, if you're constantly under stress and strain, if you're dealing with other health issues, your other health issues complicate FND. If you've only got FND and that's the only thing you have, and whatever triggered FND is now gone, you have better outcomes. So I don't think it's a general rule that you can say, do this and you'll get better. To me, it's a very individualized thing. And some people, their bodies, their brains, their minds, their environment, they're just dealing with so much that their body is always in stress and strain. Yeah. And likewise, we just had autoimmune. To me, it doesn't matter what the condition is. It is if your body's dealing with something else. So for some people, it might be autoimmune. For other people, it might be PTSD. For other people, it might be heart conditions, or it might be gut issues, or it might be a mental health condition, or eating disorders, or whatever. It doesn't matter what that condition is. If you've got an ongoing health condition that makes your body not well, it makes it harder.
and we can't function and like modulate our senses if our body is unwell.
Yeah.
I think someone asked a question about seizures. So basically it's when you have abnormal like electrical signals or communication within like your brain. And this then presents as problems in your behavior, your emotion. So you get movement disorders. So that's what a seizure is. Hope that explains.
Yeah. So with FND, I mean, some people only have seizures. Some people have seizures and motor problems, and seizures can be sort of, you know, increased movement, decreased movement, a bit like an absent seizure. And it can be like your body can't move, you're non-responsive, or you can be having abnormal movements, shaking, tremors, etc. If you had seizures, you'd probably know. Your hands freeze up, like dystonia. So hands freezing up could be dystonia when they get stuck, yeah. So some people come out of a seizure and they're left dystonic. So when they come out of a seizure, their body is locked in abnormal positions. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a massive, it's a massive topic. There's so much sort of, it's how your brain processes information from the environment, how the brain processes information from the body, and then how the brain responds to that information, how it interprets that, and then how it sends out a response. And we know with FND there's a problem with the information going to the brain, and then there's obviously a problem with the sensory processing aspect, and then how the brain responds and the body exerts movement, etc. So it very much relates to FND, and it is a really big topic, but something that I think is really relevant to FND. So well done, Mr. Brick. There's more questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We might maybe just come back to them in the end if we have time.
Yeah.
I want to try and get the content through. So thank you everyone for sharing your responses and asking questions. If there's any questions that we haven't answered, we'll try and come back to them at the end. So as Kay has just alluded to and explained this diagram, so a lot of times people with FND will have problems in modulating their responses to their sensory experiences, which then exacerbates the FND symptoms or can trigger it. So research is lacking, and hopefully in the years to come, more research is going to come out in this regards. Now I've included this pyramid here. I'm not sure if people have seen it before, but it essentially explains what we've just been talking about. So when we have problems in our central nervous system and our sensory systems, we can't go up this pyramid. So therefore we can't, go about our daily activities, learn or have, appropriate behaviors. So it all begins with the central nervous system and us understanding how our sensory systems are working. So sensory processing disorders are very common and very well understood in the pediatric settings, as someone has already mentioned, and also in the mental health setting. But we still need more research in FND. So there's always a mismatch between our internal world and how we're feeling and making sense of the information that our brain is receiving to what's in the external world, to our environment. So people are often reporting sensory disturbances, which then lead to seizures, drop attacks, paralysis. Can also be movement symptoms like having jerks or tremors, having poor balance, postural control, and that then leads to falls, or then even having changes in their food preferences. So what's the role of occupational therapy here? So ultimate goal of occupational therapy is to enable people to participate in the meaningful activities in their day-to-day life. It's things that they want to do and need to do. We can help manage their symptoms using our frameworks. And by taking a client-centered approach, we can work with people to focus on their functional motor symptoms, as well as managing their pain, their fatigue, and their sensory processing disorders. So we have a big role to play in education, so educating individuals about the 8 senses and how sensory systems work, explaining to them what arousal and self-regulations are, and what sensory processing is, and how this impacts the activities of daily life. We also play a role in helping people create their own sensory toolkit, which I'm going to explain further in the next few slides. We also do assessments, and we mentioned this not long ago. So OTs conduct comprehensive assessments to detail a person's sensory profile. One of them is the sensory profile 2 that you can see here in the diagram. So by conducting a sensory profile assessment, this is going to allow occupational therapists working with people with FND to understand how they process their sensory information. And this will play a big role in goal setting and in the intervention therapy. So we then work with individuals to establish goals that are specific to their needs and their wants and create an individualized sensory-based treatment plan. Further, we also help with pacing education. So we help people manage their pain and fatigue in FND. And with that, it involves graded exposure to sensory input and then graded re-exposure to daily activities. We can help with aids and adaptation. So we can recommend adaptive aids or equipment to manage symptoms. So things might be familiar to some people, like noise cancelling headphones, adaptive cutlery, weighted blankets, or even using this brush here, which is often used in individuals that require tactile sensation. Now, the sensory integration therapy is based on Ayer's sensory integration theory. It's providing the just right challenge for people. It's highly individualized to your sensory profile, and we can also help you create your own sensory toolbox. It uses specific equipment like swings or weighted vests or weighted blankets, and it incorporates deep pressure and proprioceptive techniques using the brushing protocol. So using this brush here. It can be incorporated within a sensory gym setting, but there are also home activities that you can do. There's a lot of sensory toys and fidgets that you can also use within this therapy. Now, sensory-based interventions to treat sensory processing difficulties are very well researched in mental health settings and in pediatrics, as we've already mentioned, but it's an emerging area here in FND. Now, this work here is based on a literature of research that came out this year by Ranford and McLean. And here they're focusing on education, increasing one's awareness of their sensory processing preferences, using sensory modalities for self-regulation, creating a sensory diet, and forming healthy habits, and generalizing these strategies across a range of activities and situations in your day-to-day life. So I'm just going to kind of talk through this table here. So the first goal is to facilitate self-awareness of your sensory processing patterns. This first starts off with a sensory assessment, so conducted by an occupational therapist, to basically identify what your sensory preferences are. We then work to establish goals and individualize a sensory-based treatment plan. We aim to give education about sensory preferences, sensory regulation, and how they relate to your FND symptoms. So it's really important to have an increased awareness of your personal symptoms. By educating you on arousal, self-regulation, and activities of daily living, and identifying sensory activities for your own management of symptoms. The second is exploring self-regulation strategies. So this involves trial and error. So exploring a range of different activities and things to see what suits you and what works for you. And then developing a personalized sensory diet. The third goal here is to expand on your self-regulation strategies. So once you have a sensory diet, you can make modifications and apply it to your day-to-day schedules. And the fourth is repertoire expansion and skill enhancement. So you apply these strategies along with your sensory diet to your daily life. So I mentioned the sensory toolkit. I'm not sure if people are familiar with this or if they have one themselves, but this is really important to satisfy your sensory diet. Now, a sensory toolkit needs to be meaningful. So it has things that are meaningful to you and that help ground you in the present moment when you are feeling stressed or dysregulated. It should aim to relieve your anxiety and should have things to help as a form of distraction from any distress or harmful thoughts. By having a sensory toolkit, you can help to be grounded, and this will allow you to achieve your sensory regulation and overall self-regulation. So it can be a box or a small bag with meaningful items. It should be easily accessible to you. And by knowing how sensory regulation impacts your life, you must prioritize your needs and work out strategies to help your regulation. This is so that you can have focus and attention and execute at higher functioning levels. Now, as occupational therapists, we can help people identify their sensory tools to manage their stressful or extreme responses in their FND symptoms. or also to identify times when you're going to experience a symptom from your triggers or the warning signs. So I ask you to look at your sensory systems. These are just examples, and I'm sure people have other things that they've tried. But if you're looking at a visual perspective, sensory activities that you can incorporate in your sensory diet can include changing lighting in the environment, reducing your visual clutter, painting calm colors on the walls, or working in an open space, or even going out in nature. From an auditory perspective, this can include reducing or eliminating noise using earbuds or noise cancelling headphones, or you might be seeking sensation, so maybe running water from a tap. From an interoception perspective, this can include activities that you can do like yoga, deep breathing, or heavy work, or deep pressure massages. From a tactile perspective, this can include, the Woolbarger brushing protocol, which I alluded to earlier. So it's the brush that you can use, and it's got a specific technique which you can do all over your body to get that tactile sensation, or using fidget toys. Now, the overall goals of a sensory diet here is to meet an individual's sensory needs and to prevent sensory overload and support your self-regulation. Now, at the end of this webinar, I will be emailing everyone a sensory diet template, which I've created. But based off this table here, I'm just going to quickly explain what a sensory diet is. So there are a number of domains. There are sensory meals. So this refers to any activity or task that can be done as part of your daily routine, which is going to give you the large amount of sensory input you need. These are just examples, but I'm happy for people to share what they do to help in that sense. So it can be going out for a walk or running, can be taking a shower or meditating, or even using a weighted blanket. A sensory snack is a quickly accessed activity which you use as needed during a challenging or difficult time. And this is just to keep yourself comfortable, focused, and grounded in the moment. This can include breathing exercises, chewing gum, or sucking on a lolly. You can use headphones or earplugs, or even wear sunglasses if you have visual overload. It can also include using fidget toys. The next component is environmental support. So making adaptations to your surroundings, whether it be at home or at work or in the school environment. And this is to enhance your self-regulation and manage your FND symptoms. It can include changing lights or decorating with plants. The next component is hideout spaces. So these are the physical places that you can access when you need alone time or quiet time, anytime during the day. Could be a spare room, could be a garden or the car. And finally, leisure activities. So these are tasks or hobbies that you enjoy doing, which you can do on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, or a monthly basis. And this is going to help provide you with the sensory input that you need to facilitate your overall well-being. So this can include, watching your favorite TV show, going to a local cafe, meeting up with friends. If anyone would like to share things that they do or that they enjoy doing to help with managing their symptoms, I'm more than welcome to hear from you.
There's some in the chat where people have shared it.
Get earplugs to wash and cook.
Mm.
One thing. Oh yeah, fisherman's friend, something similar. Yeah.
Sam O'Neill again.
Hello.
I wanted to share. I was a potter before. So I'd used pottery and clay, and I definitely would highly recommend clay and pottery, hand building, not on the wheel because of obviously some issues, but working with clay is one of the most rewarding sensory experiences and is very soothing and is very accessible for a lot of people. So that's been something that's been huge for me, being able to come back and use clay and just have that experience. But I just wanted to share that. So yeah, that's mine.
Thanks for sharing, Sam. Yeah, from people that I've spoken to over the course of the last few weeks, a lot of people have said arts and crafts, so pottery, ceramics. Oftentimes people like music, so it may not work for everyone, but it just depends on your sensory profile. Just have a look at the chat. Clay, okay, so some people have said clay is not good for them.
Mm.
Okay. Some people have pets, so animals can also provide calming and grounding sensation. And it's all to do with just tapping into, your sensory systems that are in like overload or under responsive. So yeah, I'll be sharing this flyer that I've created for people to like work on their sensory diet if they would like to explore that in further detail. So now this brings me to the end of my webinar. So just in summary, this therapy here, the sensory modulation therapy, including having sensory diet and sensory toolkit, involves meeting your sensory needs as a person with FND, experiencing any difficulties with your sensory input. This is going to help you prevent sensory overload. It supports your sensory regulation, therefore allows you to reach self-regulation. It's going to work on improving your fine and gross motor skills, improving your balance, posture, and coordination, and also improving your cognition and functional performance. This is so that you can maintain your occupations and the meaningful life roles that you have. We all come from different backgrounds. We all have different, life situations and circumstances. So this is really important. Ultimately, by undergoing this kind of therapy, you're going to be managing your functional symptoms in FND, such as seizures, which are often exacerbated or triggered by sensory input. And I'd like to thank everyone for participating. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask, or if you want to just pop them in the chat. Thank you, Jody. So David asks, can sensory regulation ultimately be a return to normal function? It's all about achieving the just right level. So sometimes you might be under or over-regulated. So with therapy, we're just trying to get to the middle ground where you are balanced.
So it could be a real core part of treatment that's not widely addressed in FND treatment. Like I said, they often do, I'll go and have CBT, go and do a course of physio. And this has been a real neglected area. And again, the question around, can I return to normal function? I still think it's around, do people have other conditions, other environmental circumstances that affecting the whole body returning to sort of normal function? So I don't think it's a clear-cut answer. Jody's asked, where do we get this treatment, please? It's finding an OT that works in this area. And then Jody's also asked, is it about distraction? Distraction can play a role. So in terms of how the brain works with FND, distraction is often important, but it's also around sensory processing. So it's not only about distraction. I haven't found an OT in my area. You can work with an OT by telehealth. This can still be done by telehealth. There's a formal assessment tool that can be done. It could be working with someone who can do it on a trial, giving advice, try this, try that. So it doesn't have to be in your area. Hydrotherapy, again, so some people are saying, I find the water soothing. So a lot of people find the water soothing. As I said, there are some people that just that sensation of water on their skin can be too much. And, again, like someone mentioned, clay is really good. Someone mentioned clay is not good. It's around where are you on that sensory profile. So it's very, very individual. You can't see an OT and go, here's your intervention plan, because it's got to fit for that individual. And also understanding that your sensory profile can change. So you can have a sensory profile and then, another health condition, more stress, more environmental stuff. Things can change. So, something might be good for you in the morning, but might not be good for you in the evenings. So sometimes you need more activation. Sometimes you need less activation. So it's really that fine tuning thing.
And it will involve a lot of trial and error, especially with like self-regulation strategies. And it really depends on the context and the environment that you're in. So very highly individualized.
Sheila's asked about the video. So the video will be available shortly. It does take me a while to upload it. So it will be available possibly within 24 hours, if not 24 hours, probably 48 hours, but it will be available. Yeah, good work, Easterbrook. So
Thank you, everyone.
a lot of people have found it interesting, and it's something that a lot of people relate to.
Yeah, definitely. Anyone have any more questions before we? Thank you, Maddie. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks,
Okay.
Michelle.
Well,
I think we might wrap up here.
yep.
So yeah, this will be made available as Kate mentioned. Thank you all for participating and listening today, and I really hope that this was helpful for people.
Thanks, it's great.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks so much. This is recording.